Okay, Battle of Agincourt, 1415. Now, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was the third of the three great victories of the English over the French. It's the third of the three great victories of the English over the French in the Hundred Years' War. And as you will see in a moment, the other two victories were Crécy in 1346 and then Poitiers in 1356. So what was the Hundred Years' War? Well, the first thing is to say that although it's called the Hundred Years' War, it actually ran from 1337 to 1453. So technically, it was the 116 Years' War. Well, to understand the origin of the Hundred Years' War, you need to understand that France was a very different place 700 years ago. There was a Kingdom of France, but there were also independent or semi-independent territories, as well as possessions of the English crown, which dated from 1066, the Norman conquest. And all of these are now part of modern France. Here are a couple of maps to give you a feel for the geography of the time. The map on the left shows the situation in the second half of the 12th century when King Henry II of England ruled over the enormous Angevin Empire, which consisted of much of modern-day France as well as England. Everything on this map in red or pink is effectively English, or rather owes allegiance to the King of England, not to the King of France. However, this was before King John lost most of his French possessions, and the map on the right shows the extent of King John's losses. As you can see, sadly, there is now little left, and I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. Well, here's the situation in just over 100 years beyond those first maps at the start of the 100 Years' War. And in this map, I'm afraid the English parts are green and the French parts orange. Here's the situation after the Battle of Poitiers, and then after the Battle of Agincourt, and finally, the situation at the end of the 100 Years' War. It's virtually all French. But how did the 100 Years' War start? Well, it began with trade disputes. England at that time exported large quantities of wool to Flanders, where the merchants made good profits from turning it into cloth. Now, Flanders was a county of France, and its count owed his allegiance to Philip VI, King of France. The count interfered with the wool trade on behalf of King Philip to such an extent that King Edward III of England embargoed wool for Flanders. The Flanders merchants were horrified, they feared economic ruin, and they rebelled. They deposed their count and they asked King Edward to come to their aid. Philip of France retaliated in 1337 by seizing some English possessions in Aquitaine and then raiding the English south coast. In 1339, Philip assembled an invasion army of 30,000 men, whereupon King Edward landed with his own army in France. King Philip of France now withdrew, while Edward formally declared himself to be the true King of France, a claim which was not formally dropped by Britain until 1802. Now, the 100 Years' War was well underway. Although King Philip of France constantly avoided battle, whilst King Edward of England constantly ran short of funds to support his army in France. England was not in a strong position to challenge France. Her population was only 4 million compared to France's 10 million, both populations, by the way, being 90 or 95% peasant. Yet England did have one major advantage: a more advanced military organization. And this was due to King Edward reorganizing the army after the disaster at Bannockburn in Scotland in 1314. He moved away from a feudal army by creating a permanent force, regularly paid and under contract, a professional army rather than a feudal army. On tactics and weaponry, Edward thought that a battle fought exclusively between heavily armored cavalry would always favor the side with the greater numbers, and France would always enjoy greater numbers. So he decided to emphasize the use of archers with longbows attacking the enemy at long range in order to significantly reduce their numbers before they could close in hand-to-hand combat. Perhaps this is an appropriate time to consider the men and their weapons who fought in the 100 Years' War. I'll divide them into three categories. First of all, there are the men-at-arms. Now, knights were men-at-arms, but most men-at-arms were not knights. Only some 8% of English men-at-arms at Agincourt were knights. Many of them were esquires who were people hoping to become knights. Many of them were professional soldiers. Now, whilst the men-at-arms possessed horses and might be deployed in cavalry charges, the English men-at-arms generally fought on foot. They were all, to a greater or lesser extent, armoured. Chainmail had given way to plate armour, which might, in some cases, cover the entire body. A complete suit of armour might weigh 60 or 80 pounds. The weight, for example, that a modern infantryman might carry on a march, but certainly would not carry when engaged in close combat. The helmet or bassinet, often with visor, was heavy and uncomfortable. Shields, often painted with the arms of its owner, were fast falling out of favour at this time, which made identification of individuals on the battlefield difficult. And so men-at-arms began wearing a coat of arms. And here you can see a drawing of Henry V. Now, the coat of arms allowed you to be identified and also indicated that you might be valuable as a prisoner, and it probably saved many a life. A man-at-arms might carry a lance for use on horseback or a poleaxe for use on foot. He would also carry a sword, and he might have a dagger for dispatching a wounded opponent. Well, let's now look at the archer and his longbow. The longbow was 6 feet in length, and a trained archer could fire up to a dozen aimed shots per minute to an effective range of 250 yards. Now, just compare this to the muskets at Waterloo, 400 to 500 years later, firing 3 to 4 rounds per minute to an effective range of less than 100 yards. And when I fired the Brown Bess as a cadet at Sandhurst, I found it difficult enough to hit a man-sized target at 25 yards. Well, at 250 yards, the bodkin arrow that you can see here, which was a yard long and fitted with a barbed tip, would penetrate chainmail. To fully draw the bowstring back required a pull of 70 pounds, and archers had to be skilled, but they had to be strong and possess stamina too in order to pull the bowstring back. And we know this largely from the bows and also the skeletons of archers that were recovered from the Mary Rose, which sank off Portsmouth. Well, resupply of arrows was a potential problem at this stage. Each archer would carry 2 sheaves of arrows, totaling 48, which weighed about 6 pounds, and then there was the weight of the quiver as well. Some arrows they would stick in the ground in front of themselves in the battle line for ready use. Others they might stick in their belt. There would have been further stocks of arrows immediately behind the line, and further reserve stocks of arrows would have been held in the baggage train. But of course, to access these, men would have had to have been sent back. And so plucking arrows from corpses would have been a common and necessary expedient. And documents of the time seem to indicate that 100 arrows per archer was the normal establishment for a campaign, but there were probably additional supplies beyond that. Well, at times of heightened tension, it was difficult to satisfy the requisition orders for bows and arrows which went out across England. In 1359, for example, the Royal Armoury at the Tower of London received 150,000 arrows, 20,000 bows, and 50,000 bowstrings. So, how were archers to be deployed as part of the English army? Well, a new tactic for the employment of archers was developed, and it found its first test in September 1342 at Morlaix in Brittany. Here, the English achieved a great victory against overwhelming odds by deploying archers in wedges known as hearses. These wedges were pushed forward from both wings, and possibly also pushed forward from the center of the main battle line consisting of dismounted men-at-arms who were armed with swords and also with spearmen. So when the enemy attacked, they were exposed to a withering flanking arrow fire from both sides. Archers would also carry or cut locally staves which they could drive into the ground to give them protection against cavalry charges. And in addition, King Edward instigated groups of mounted archers, allowing them to be deployed rapidly and to concentrate at a strategic point and bring down an arrow storm on the enemy. Well, while the organization and tactics of the English army was experiencing an historic and revolutionary sea change, the French, by contrast, clung to the old tactics of using massed armored mounted knights to punch a hole through the enemy front line. Through this hole, they hoped that they would be able to pour overwhelming numbers of mercenaries and poorly trained and ill-equipped armed militia. The French did have archery in the form of Genoese mercenaries armed with crossbows, but the crossbows were cumbersome, heavy weapons. They fired bolts or darts, known as quarrels, to a greater range than longbows, but a rate of only 2 bolts every 3 minutes. And during that time, a longbowman could fire 36 arrows. In addition to that problem, there was the problem that every crossbowman needed a second man to carry a shield known as a pavise, so that the crossbowman could reload his crossbow under cover. The French army was also much less well-disciplined than the English. At the top of the social tree, the French knights were notably arrogant, independently minded, and unreliable, whilst at the bottom of the tree, the foot soldiers were, by local accounts, more likely to plunder their own countryside than the invading English would. And here you can see a bit of plundering going on. Well, King Edward III also introduced a new form of warfare, and this was called the chevauchée. This was a large-scale raid which sought to avoid battle, but instead passed through enemy territory, causing damage and weakening an enemy's economic base and moral authority. Such a force would largely live off the surrounding countryside that it passed through. It did not secure territory, and it avoided besieging towns. And in the 3 great 100 Years' War of English victories that I mentioned earlier on, Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, this involved an English chevauchée being caught and forced to stand in battle by a larger French army. But more of that to come. Well, after some inconclusive truces in the early 1340s, King Edward III brought over to France an army of some 15,000 men. It rampaged around Brittany and Normandy quite successfully until on the 26th of August 1346, it was challenged by a much larger French army at Crécy. The English took up a strong defensive position where they were attacked repeatedly by French cavalry in piecemeal charges before the whole French army had assembled. In all, the French charged 15 times right up until midnight, and they suffered terrible losses. In the morning, the survivors charged a 16th time and were beaten back, and the English then advanced and pursued the French. For the loss of a few hundred men, the English had killed some 1,500 French knights and several thousand foot. Present at the Battle of Crécy was Prince Edward, son of King Edward, also known as Edward of Woodstock, but known to history as the Black Prince. He was aged only 16. He fought with distinction at the battle, and he learned a number of lessons. Firstly, he learned the lesson that holding a strong tactical position was more important than attacking with numerical superiority. And secondly, he learned that an enemy could be fooled into attacking an English position by making the English situation appear weaker than it actually was. Now, in the 9 years that followed Crécy, there were few major confrontations, and King Philip of France died in 1350 and was succeeded by King Jean II. Well, in 1355, King Edward set in motion a three-pronged attack on France. The plan was for two armies to threaten Paris, one from the north, one from the west, whilst another army distracted the French by attacking from Gascony in the south. That southern army, 6,000 strong, was led by the Black Prince. It landed in Bordeaux, the capital of Gascony, in September 1355, and began to capture many towns in neighboring French territory. After a lull in fighting over the winter, the next year, on the 4th of August, 1356, the Black Prince set off from Bergerac on a chevauchée with an army of 8,000, including 6,000 archers, all mounted, all trained and battle ready. They were well provisioned, as 48,000 arrows and almost 60,000 bowstrings had been shipped from England before they set off. The army cut a swathe of devastation some 50 miles wide and covered 200 miles in 24 days. Now, what did the French do? Well, initially, King Jean of France avoided a battle. He was wary of the English due to the experience of Crécy only 10 years before. So instead, he shadowed the English, whilst at the same time building up an overwhelmingly large army. But eventually, King Jean was forced by his nobles to attack the English, and the Black Prince realized that he had no option but to stand and fight. The Black Prince carefully recce'd the ground and chose a defensive position some 4 miles south of Poitiers. The site was 900 yards wide. It was situated between two dense woods with a shallow boggy bowl to the front. He set his army to preparing defenses. They dug ditches, and they brought up supplies of arrows. Now, although the subsequent battle lasted for several hours, and I haven't got time to go into it, it resulted in a complete victory for the English. The French attacked in 3 divisions. The first division disintegrated in the face of the English arrow storm. The survivors retreated in confusion through the second division, which was moving up behind. This second division, somewhat demoralized by the carnage of the first division, struggled through the mud up to the English front line, but were easily halted. The Black Prince sensed an opportunity, and he brought up 700 archers behind his center, who fired overhead and down into the faces of the French, who were already suffering an arrow storm from the English archers on their flanks. The French second division now collapsed utterly and fled the battlefield, with its commander, the Dauphin, in other words, the Crown Prince, personally leading 800 uncommitted knights away from the battlefield. King Jean was beaten and he could have withdrawn, but his third division was as yet undefeated. And by the way, that third division, just by itself, still outnumbered the entire English army. And he decided to attack once more. The result was again utter catastrophe, and King Jean was captured. Against just a few hundred English dead, the French lost almost 2,000 taken prisoner, including one king, that's King Jean, one prince, 11 counts, and one archbishop. Plus, there were between 2,500 and 5,000 dead, including the flower of the French nobility. The battles of Crécy and Poitiers killed more of the French nobility than did the Black Death. Well, the battles of Poitiers and Crécy revealed a gulf between society in England and society in France. France was trailing well behind England in the development of a national spirit, a national army organization, and the pragmatic recognition of one class by one class of another and by one specialist of another. And all of that allowed the English and the Welsh to form a homogeneous military power out of a heterogeneous mass. By comparison, the nobility of France were intensely proud. They were independent, selfish, haughty, and they desperately clung to feudalism. They didn't mix with ordinary French soldiers. In fact, they despised them. They also despised the Genoese mercenary crossbowmen just as much, probably, as they despised the yeoman and peasant archers of England. Their idea of war was to arrive at an agreed time and place and fight a battle as if it was a grand tournament, vying with each other for the honor of charging the enemy first without any regard for the wishes or orders of their king. And some people would say, well, why didn't the French, after those two great defeats, why did they not adopt the longbow? Well, in fact, they began to. And a French commentator, just after Poitiers, wrote as follows. In a short time, the French archers became so expert in the use of the bow that they could shoot with a surer aim than the English. Indeed, if these archers had formed a close confederacy amongst themselves, they might have become more powerful than the princes and nobles of France. It was a fear of just such an outcome that made the French king suppress the archer army, unquote. And I think this is entirely credible because of the state of French society. In the 1360s, there was much social unrest in France. And there was a lot of looting by brigands known as the Jacquerie, which is there. And it wasn't just in France, because in England at this time you had Wat Tyler's rebellion. Anyway, on to the next slide, which is the Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, and it marked the high point of English territorial expansion in the 100 Years' War, and it bought 9 years of peace. Sadly for England, the Black Prince died before his father, and so King Edward III was succeeded not by the Black Prince, but by the Black Prince's son as Richard II. Richard II, however, was deposed by another of Edward's grandsons, Henry Bolingbroke, and he reigned as Henry IV. In 1413, Henry IV's 25-year-old son came to the throne as King Henry V, and he was determined to unite the crowns of England and France.